The small intestine is a part of the digestive tract specialized in absorbing nutrients and minerals from the food we eat. It's located in the abdominopelvic cavity, and it begins at the pylorus of the stomach and it ends at the ileocecal junction, where it continues with the large intestine. It has three major components: the duodenum, which can be divided into four parts, the jejunum, and the ileum. Now, when talking about structures of the abdomen, we often encounter the terms retroperitoneal or intraperitoneal. Retroperitoneal is a description for abdominal structures that are only partially covered by peritoneum and lie posterior or behind the abdominal peritoneum, where intraperitoneal means that these structures have invaginated and are completely covered by the visceral peritoneum. So, of these components, the proximal portion of the first part of the duodenum, in addition to the jejunum and ileum, are intraperitoneal, where the distal portion of the first part of the duodenum, in addition to the second, third, and fourth parts of the duodenum, are retroperitoneal, and are found posteriorly in the retroperitoneal cavity. That being said, let's have a closer look at the duodenum and its four parts. Overall, the duodenum is shaped like the letter C, curving around the head of the pancreas, and consists of the first or superior part, second or descending part, third or inferior part, and fourth or ascending part. The first part lies in the transverse plane and begins anterolaterally to the right of the L1 vertebral body, continuing to the pylorus. The proximal portion of the first part has a segment of the lesser omentum called the hepatoduodenal ligament attached to its superior surface, and the greater omentum attached to the inferior surface. The proximal 2 centimeters of the first part is also more dilated and freely mobile, as it is intraperitoneal with its anterior and posterior surface covered in peritoneum, and is referred to as the ampulla or the duodenal cap. This is in contrast to the distal 3 centimeters, which is retroperitoneal and therefore not mobile. The first part of the duodenum travels laterally to the right and has the liver and gallbladder overlying it, and it has the IVC, bile duct, and gastroduodenal artery posterior. The second part, or descending part of the duodenum, is completely retroperitoneal. It curves downward around the head of the pancreas, which is medial, and runs inferiorly from the L1 to the L3 vertebra, to the right of and parallel to the IVC. Overlying the second part is the transverse colon and the convolutions of the small intestine, where posterior to it there's the hilum of the right kidney, its vessels, and ureter. If we open up the second part of the duodenum and look inside, we can see the major duodenal papilla on its posteromedial wall. That's where the main pancreatic duct combines with the common bile duct to form a hepatopancreatic ampulla, which carries the pancreatic juices and bile to the duodenum. Of note, these can also be referred to as the papilla of Vater and ampulla of Vater respectively, not to be confused with the popular Darth Vader. Sometimes, above the major duodenal papilla, there is also a minor duodenal papilla where the accessory pancreatic duct opens. The duodenum then turns to the left, and the third part starts at the level of L3. This part is also completely retroperitoneal. The third part of the duodenum passes horizontally to the left below the head of the pancreas. Posterior to it are the inferior vena cava, or IVC, the aorta, the proximal parts of the inferior mesenteric vessels, and the body of the L3 vertebra. Anterior to the inferior part, there are the superior mesenteric artery, or SMA, the superior mesenteric vein, or SMV, and parts of the jejunum. Finally, the duodenum turns upwards and becomes its fourth part, called the ascending part, which ascends to the left of the L3 vertebra and aorta, up to the L2 vertebral level and the inferior border of the pancreas. Medial to the fourth part, there are the SMA, SMV, and uncinate process of the pancreas. Then it turns anteriorly to connect with the jejunum, forming the duodenojejunal flexure, or junction, at the level of L2. This site hangs by the suspensory muscle of the duodenum, also known as the ligament of Treitz, that is made out of the skeletal muscles from the diaphragm and the smooth muscles of the duodenum. Now, the duodenum mainly gets arterial blood from the celiac trunk and the SMA. The celiac trunk gives off the common hepatic artery, which also gives rise to the supraduodenal artery supplying portions of the first and second duodenal parts, and the gastroduodenal artery, which has a branch called the superior pancreaticoduodenal artery that supplies the first two parts of the duodenum up until the major duodenal papilla. The SMA, on the other hand, gives off a branch called the inferior pancreaticoduodenal artery, which supplies the other two parts of the duodenum distal to the major duodenal papilla. The superior and inferior pancreaticoduodenal arteries give anterior and posterior branches that connect with each other, forming anastomoses between the celiac trunk and the SMA. The veins of the duodenum drain alongside the arteries, and venous blood is collected by the splenic and superior mesenteric vein, which eventually drain into the hepatic portal vein. The lymphatic vessels of the duodenum accompany arteries as well, and drain via the pancreaticoduodenal lymph nodes located along the superior and inferior pancreaticoduodenal arteries to the pyloric lymph nodes along the gastroduodenal artery and the superior mesenteric lymph nodes along the SMA. All of these ultimately drain into the celiac lymph nodes. As for the innervation of the duodenum, the sympathetic fibers derive from the greater thoracic splanchnic nerves arising from T5 to T9, the lesser thoracic splanchnic nerves from T10 to T11, while the parasympathetic fibers derive from the vagus nerves. Together, these fibers of both the SNS and PNS go to the celiac and superior mesenteric plexuses that surround the roots of these arteries. Here, the sympathetic fibers synapse in prevertebral ganglia, such as the celiac and superior mesenteric ganglion, and send their postsynaptic sympathetic fibers through the periarterial plexuses following the pancreaticoduodenal arteries. The parasympathetic fibers, on the other hand, just pass through the celiac and superior mesenteric plexuses, as well as the periarterial plexuses, and eventually synapse in the intrinsic ganglia found in the walls of the duodenum, giving short postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers to their destination. Both of these nerve pathways eventually send their postsynaptic fibers to innervate the duodenum. Before we move on, let's take a break and see if you can identify the arterial blood supply of the duodenum. Now, after the duodenum, we have the jejunum, which is the second part of the small intestine, beginning at the duodenojejunal flexure, where the small intestine becomes intraperitoneal again. And after the jejunum, there's the ileum, which is the third and final part of the small intestine. There is no clear visible demarcation between the jejunum and ileum, but when we divide the abdominopelvic cavity into 4 quadrants, we can see that the jejunum is mainly situated in the left upper quadrant, while the ileum is mostly in the right lower quadrant. Together, the jejunum and ileum are about 7 meters long, with the jejunum taking the first 2/5 and the ileum the last 3/5 of the length. On the right side of the pelvic cavity, the ileum terminates into the medial side of the cecum at the iliocecal junction. Now, since they are intraperitoneal, both the jejunum and ileum are covered by visceral peritoneum. Where the visceral peritoneum reflects off the walls of the intestine, it creates a double fold of peritoneum called the mesentery, which attaches the jejunum and ileum to the posterior abdominal wall. The root of the mesentery extends from the duodenojejunal flexure on the left side of the L2 vertebra across the ascending and inferior parts of the duodenum, aorta, and IVC, all the way to the iliocecal junction and the right sacroiliac joint. Between the folds of the mesentery, there are the superior mesenteric vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves that supply the small intestine, as well as fat tissue. The arterial blood supply for the jejunum and ileum is provided by the SMA, which travels within the mesentery, giving off around 15 to 18 jejunal and ileal artery branches. On their way toward the intestines, these branches connect with each other and form loops called the arterial arcades, which give rise to many straight arteries known as the vasa recta. And here's where the difference between the jejunum and ileum comes in. The jejunum has fewer arcades with larger loops and longer vasa recta, while the ileum has more arcades with shorter loops and shorter vasa recta. Lymphatic drainage of the jejunum and ileum start in specialized lymphatic vessels in the intestinal villi called lacteals. These empty into lymphatic plexuses in the walls of the jejunum and ileum, which drain into a variety of lymphatic vessels and nodes found in the layers of mesentery. Eventually, all these collect into the superior mesenteric lymph nodes. Furthermore, lymph from the terminal ileum drains into the ileocolic lymph nodes. As for the innervation of the jejunum and ileum, the sympathetic fibers derive mainly from the T8 to T10 portions of the greater and lesser thoracic splanchnic nerves, while the parasympathetic fibers derive from vagus nerves. Just like for the duodenum, they all go to the celiac and superior mesenteric plexuses, where sympathetic fibers synapse in the celiac and superior mesenteric ganglia and pass through the periarterial plexuses, and parasympathetic pass through all these plexuses to synapse in the intrinsic ganglia in the intestinal wall, where both pathways eventually continue on to innervate the jejunum and ileum. Remember, sympathetic innervation reduces peristaltic and secretory activity to stop digestion, where parasympathetic increases peristaltic and secretory activity, facilitating digestion. Also, don't forget about sensory information. Visceral afferent fibers conveying pain travel with the sympathetic fibers, and visceral afferent fibers conveying reflex sensations travel with the parasympathetic fibers. Let's take another quick break and see if you can identify the jejunum and ileum, as well as their blood supply. Alright, as a quick recap, the small intestine has three major parts: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. The duodenum has four parts. Most of the duodenum is retroperitoneal except for the proximal portion of the first part. The duodenum continues with the jejunum at the duodenojejunal junction, which is suspended by the ligament of Treitz. The jejunum and ileum are intraperitoneal structures, where the jejunum is mostly situated in the upper left quadrant and ileum in the lower right quadrant. Another difference is that the jejunum has longer vasa recta and fewer arcades with larger loops, while the ileum has shorter vasa recta and more arcades with shorter loops. The ileum continues with the large intestine at the ileocecal junction. The small intestine is supplied from the celiac trunk and the SMA via the superior and inferior pancreatico-duodenal arteries and jejunal and ileal arteries respectively. Lymphatic drainage follows the nodes of the arteries supplying the small intestine, which eventually go on to drain into the superior mesenteric and celiac nodes. Sympathetic innervation comes from the greater and lesser splanchnic nerves, while the parasympathetic fibers derive from the vagus nerves. Visceral afferents for pain travel with sympathetic nerves, and reflex sensation with parasympathetic nerves.
Both the spleen and the pancreas are visceral organs in the foregut. Don't get too excited though, that's where their similarities end. Other characteristics such as the shape and function within the body are quite different. So let's break them down. Alright, let's begin with the spleen, which has a few different important functions. Prenatally, it functions as the hematopoietic organ, which means that it makes fetal blood cells. After birth, the spleen is like a hub for lymphocyte proliferation, as well as a recycling center for damaged red blood cells and platelets, and a blood reservoir, from which backup blood can be pumped into circulation after significant hemorrhage. For this reason, we think of our spleen as our own personal blood bank. The spleen is an oval-shaped organ located in the left upper quadrant of the abdomen and is intraperitoneal. This means that the spleen is entirely enveloped in visceral peritoneum, except at the splenic hilum where the vasculature enters and exits the organ. The spleen has an anterior, superior, and inferior border. The superior border of the spleen is easily recognizable due to its notched appearance. The outer surface of the spleen can also be divided into two parts: the diaphragmatic surface, which is in contact with the concavity of the diaphragm, and the visceral surface, that is in contact with the surrounding abdominal viscera. Now let's break down the anatomical relationships of the spleen with its surrounding structures. The left portion of the diaphragm and the 9th to 11th ribs lie posterior to the spleen, with the diaphragm acting like a barrier between the spleen and the ribs. The stomach lies anterior to the spleen, and the two connect at the greater curvature of the stomach via the gastrosplenic ligament. The spleen is lateral to the left kidney, and the two are connected via the splenorenal ligament. The gastrosplenic and the splenorenal ligament contain splenic vessels within them and attach to the splenic hilum. The tail of the pancreas also often contacts the splenic hilum. Lastly, the spleen lies just superior to the left colic flexure of the large intestine. Now let's talk about blood supply, lymphatic drainage, and innervation. The spleen gets its blood supply via the splenic artery, which is a branch of the celiac trunk. After arising from the celiac trunk, the splenic artery takes a tortuous path posterior to the omental bursa and runs along the superior border of the pancreas, ending at the splenic hilum. The twisting and turning of the splenic artery gives it a worm-like appearance that is easily distinguishable. At the level of the hilum, the splenic artery then divides into several branches, which enter the spleen to supply its different vascular segments. Venous blood drains from the spleen via the splenic vein, which travels posterior to the pancreas, receiving the inferior mesenteric vein, and eventually uniting with the superior mesenteric vein to form the hepatic portal vein. Lymph from the spleen collects in the splenic lymph nodes, located at the hilum, which eventually drain to the pancreaticosplenic and celiac lymph nodes, using lymphatic vessels that run alongside the splenic vessels. Finally, splenic innervation is provided by nerve fibers of the celiac plexus, which course along the splenic artery. Okay, let's take a quick break and try to recall the name and origin of the artery supplying the spleen. Alright, now let's shift gears and talk about the pancreas. The pancreas is an elongated accessory digestive organ that sits directly behind the stomach at the level of the transpyloric plane, or the L1 and L2 vertebral bodies. The pancreas is considered a retroperitoneal organ, with the exception of its tail portion, which is intraperitoneal. The pancreas is both an exocrine gland, secreting pancreatic juices into the duodenum to help with digestion, and an endocrine gland, secreting insulin and glucagon directly into the bloodstream in order to regulate blood sugar metabolism. You could say the pancreas is working two full-time jobs. Anatomically, the pancreas is divided into 5 parts: the head, the uncinate process, the neck, the body, and the tail. And each of these parts have numerous relationships with surrounding structures. Let's begin with the head of the pancreas, which sits within the curvature of the duodenum, just inferior to the level of the transpyloric plane and to the right of the superior mesenteric artery. A small part of the uncinate process projects medially from the inferior portion of the head, posterior to the SMA. Next, we have the neck, which lies anterior to the superior mesenteric vessels and posterior to the pylorus of the stomach. The body lies to the left of the superior mesenteric vessels and posterior to the stomach, continuing just above the transpyloric plane. Finally, the tail of the pancreas is anterior to the left kidney and medial to the spleen. It's closely related to the splenic hilum and is contained within the layers of the splenorenal ligament, alongside the splenic vessels, making the tail of the pancreas intraperitoneal. The transverse mesocolon also attaches to the anterior surface of the pancreas. Now, the digestive juices produced by the pancreas are secreted into a large duct known as the main pancreatic duct, which eventually leads to the duodenum. The main pancreatic duct starts in the tail and runs towards the head, where it unites with the bile duct coming from the liver to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla, also known as the ampulla of Vater. The hepatopancreatic ampulla enters into the descending part of the duodenum through an opening known as the major duodenal papilla. This papilla is surrounded by a ring of smooth muscle called the sphincter of Oddi, which acts as a door that opens and closes to control the flow of pancreatic juice and bile into the duodenal lumen. Sometimes an anatomical variation occurs where the main pancreatic duct gives a branch known as the accessory pancreatic duct, which opens into the duodenum at a separate location known as the minor duodenal papilla. Let's take another break and see if you can label the parts of the pancreas, A through E. Now let's talk about blood supply, lymphatic drainage, and innervation of the pancreas. Most of the arterial supply is provided by pancreatic branches of the splenic artery. A smaller portion of its blood supply, especially to the head and the uncinate process, is supplied by the anterior and posterior superior pancreatico-duodenal arteries, which are branches of the gastroduodenal artery, and also by the anterior and posterior inferior pancreatico-duodenal arteries, which are branches of the superior mesenteric artery. Venous blood leaves the pancreas through the pancreatic veins, which in turn empty into the superior mesenteric and splenic veins. Lymph collects in the pancreatico-splenic lymph nodes lying along the splenic artery, in addition to the pyloric lymph nodes. Lastly, sympathetic innervation to the pancreas is provided by the greater and lesser splanchnic nerves, while parasympathetic innervation is from the vagus nerve. Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers pass through the celiac and superior mesenteric plexuses before reaching the pancreas. Alright, as a quick recap, the spleen is an intraperitoneal organ located in the left upper quadrant of the abdomen. The spleen is mainly responsible for red blood cell and platelet filtration, and also plays a major role in immune system function. Its arterial supply is from the splenic artery, while venous blood drains into the splenic vein. The pancreas is a mainly retroperitoneal organ that sits posterior to the stomach. It is anatomically divided into 5 parts: the head, the uncinate process, the neck, the body, and the tail. The pancreas has a dual role as an endocrine gland, regulating blood sugar metabolism, and an exocrine gland, secreting the pancreatic juice into the duodenum. These juices channel through the main pancreatic duct, joining the bile duct to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which secretes into the duodenum through the major duodenal papilla. Blood supply of the pancreas is provided by the pancreatic branches of the splenic artery in the superior and inferior pancreatico-duodenal arteries.
The large intestine is a part of the digestive tract specialized in absorbing water from the residual digested food coming from the small intestines while forming and storing feces until defecation occurs. The large intestine, or colon, begins at the ileocecal junction, where it is continuous with the ileum, which is the final part of the small intestine. There are 3 main features that distinguish the large intestine from the small intestine, besides the fact that the large intestine has a, larger caliber. First, the large intestine has omental appendices, which present as fatty outgrowths covered by visceral peritoneum. Second, there are the teniae coli, which are 3 strips of smooth muscle that run lengthwise from the base of the appendix through the colon and merge at the recto-sigmoid junction to form a longitudinal layer around the rectum. The third and final differentiating feature is that the large intestine has haustra, which are pouch-like bulges of the intestinal wall that form between the teniae when they contract. The large intestine has several major components: the cecum, appendix, ascending, transverse, and descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anal canal. The cecum is the first part of the large intestine, and it receives the terminal ileum, which invaginates into the medial side of the cecum. The cecum lies in the right iliac fossa in the right lower quadrant of the abdomen, and it looks a bit like an intestinal pouch. It is intraperitoneal, mobile, and doesn't have its own mesentery. On its posteromedial wall, inferior to the ileocecal junction, the cecum has a blind-ended organ called the appendix, which can vary in length up to and over 10 centimeters. The appendix is usually retrocecal, meaning behind the cecum, but its position can vary a bit as well. It's full of lymphoid tissue, and its proximal part has attachment to the cecum by a small mesentery called the mesoappendix. Now, if we open up the large intestine and look inside, we can see that the terminal ileum protrudes a bit into the cecum, forming the ileal papilla with the ileal orifice at its center. The orifice is usually closed due to tonic contraction, and the lips of the ileal papilla serve as passive flaps to prevent regurgitation of fecal matter from the cecum into the ileum. Just inferior to the ileal orifice, there's the opening to the appendix. Finally, starting at the cecum and throughout the whole large intestine, there are multiple semilunar folds that are found in between and separate the haustra from one another. Then, the cecum continues as the second part of the large intestine, or the ascending colon. The ascending colon extends superiorly from the cecum along the right side of the abdominal cavity towards the right lobe of the liver. Inferior to the liver and below the 9th and 10th ribs, the colon turns to the left, forming the right colic flexure, also called the hepatic flexure. The ascending colon is positioned retroperitoneally, therefore just behind the peritoneum. Laterally, between the ascending colon and the lateral abdominal wall is a shallow trench covered by parietal peritoneum called the right paracolic gutter. Medial to the ascending colon is the small intestine, while anteriorly is the greater omentum. Now, after the ascending colon comes the transverse colon, which extends from the right colic flexure, or hepatic flexure, and travels horizontally to the left. Once at the spleen, it turns downwards in front of the lower portion of the left kidney to become the descending colon, and this gives us the left colic flexure, or splenic flexure, which is more superior than the hepatic flexure and has a more acute angle. The transverse colon is intraperitoneal and therefore mobile and can hang down to the level of the umbilicus. It has a mesentery called the transverse mesocolon that is rooted alongside the inferior border of the pancreas, loops down, and can extend past the iliac crests. The fourth part of the colon is the descending colon that stretches from the left colic flexure, lateral to the left kidney, down to the left iliac fossa, where it connects to the sigmoid colon. Just like the ascending colon, the descending colon is retroperitoneal and covered by peritoneum on its anterolateral side. Also similar to the right side of the body, there's a left paracolic gutter between the descending colon and the left abdominal wall. In the left iliac fossa, the descending colon ends and the fifth part of the large intestine, known as the sigmoid colon, follows. As it descends towards the third sacral vertebra, the sigmoid colon makes an S shape as it connects and continues as the rectum. The sigmoid colon is intraperitoneal, very mobile, and has a mesentery called the sigmoid mesocolon. The rectum is the terminal part of the large intestine, is fixed retroperitoneally, and is continuous inferiorly as the anal canal. Also note that the Taeniae coli mentioned previously end at the rectum, where they form a continuous muscle layer, and this transition point indicates the rectosigmoid junction. Let's take a quick break and see if you can identify all parts of the large intestine. Now let's talk about the arterial supply of the large intestine. The cecum is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery through its terminal branch called the ileocolic artery, and the appendix is supplied by the appendicular artery, which in turn is a branch of the ileocolic artery. The ascending colon receives arterial blood from the branch of the SMA called the right colic artery, and also from the ileocolic artery, and these two arteries also anastomose with each other. The transverse colon is supplied by a branch of the SMA called the middle colic artery. The middle colic artery anastomoses with the right colic artery, and they together supply the right colic flexure. The descending and sigmoid colon are supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery, or IMA for short, that gives two branches, the left colic artery and the sigmoid arteries, which anastomose with each other. The left colic artery also anastomoses with the middle colic artery at the left colic flexure, which it supplies. The IMA gives one last terminal branch, called the superior rectal artery, that supplies the superior part of the rectum. Now, looking at the blood supply of the whole large intestine, from the cecum to the rectum, we can see that all adjacent major arteries, including the ileocolic, right, middle, left colic, and sigmoid arteries, share anastomoses with each other. This gives rise to the marginal artery, which runs the entire length of the colon close to the mesenteric border. Now, venous blood from the cecum and appendix drain into the ileocolic vein, the ascending colon drains into the ileocolic and right colic vein, and from the transverse colon into the middle colic vein, which all drain into the superior mesenteric vein. Blood from the descending and sigmoid colon is collected into the left colic veins and sigmoid veins, which drain into the inferior mesenteric vein, which further drains into the splenic vein, and finally into the hepatic portal vein. Lymphatic vessels of the large intestine drain into the local lymph nodes around the intestines and then into lymph nodes following the arteries that supply those regions. Therefore, the lymph from the cecum, appendix, ascending, and transverse colon flows to the ileocolic nodes, right colic nodes, and middle colic nodes, respectively, which all drain into the superior mesenteric lymph nodes. Lymphatics from the descending and sigmoid colon drain into the left colic lymph nodes along the left colic artery and eventually pass into the inferior mesenteric lymph nodes. And finally, let's look at the innervation of the large intestine. Before we start, though, recall that sympathetic fibers to the large intestine derive from the abdominopelvic splanchnic nerves composed of thoracic and lumbar splanchnic nerves, and parasympathetic fibers are from the vagus nerve and pelvic splanchnic nerves. So, for the cecum, appendix, ascending, and transverse colon, sympathetic fibers derive mainly from the lesser thoracic splanchnic nerves coming from T10 and T11, while the parasympathetic fibers are derived from the vagus nerves. Together, they go to the superior and inferior mesenteric plexuses, where only the sympathetic fibers synapse in different prevertebral ganglia to their postsynaptic neurons. Then, both of these nerve pathways pass through to the periarterial plexuses, where the parasympathetic fibers will eventually synapse to their postsynaptic fibers through intrinsic ganglia located within the intestinal walls. After synapsing in their respective ganglia, both nerve pathways eventually go on to innervate the cecum, appendix, ascending, and transverse colon. For the descending and sigmoid colon, the sympathetic innervation is mainly from the least thoracic splanchnic nerves coming from T12, as well as the lumbar splanchnic nerves coming from L1 to L3, which all go on to travel through the superior and inferior mesenteric plexuses and superior hypogastric plexus, where they will synapse, with fibers eventually traveling through the periarterial plexuses before reaching their end destination. In regard to the parasympathetic innervation, the vagus nerve stops its parasympathetic innervation at the level of the left colic flexure, so below this point the parasympathetic innervation now comes from the pelvic splanchnic nerves, which derive from the anterior rami of spinal nerves S2 to S4. These fibers then travel through the inferior hypogastric plexus and eventually synapse in intrinsic ganglia throughout the abdominal viscera near the structures they innervate. After synapsing in their respective ganglia, both nerve pathways eventually go on to innervate the descending and sigmoid colon. Remember, sympathetic innervation reduces peristaltic and secretory activity to stop digestion, where parasympathetic increases peristaltic and secretory activity, facilitating digestion. And last, there are the autonomic visceral afferent fibers, which conduct reflex and pain sensations for the large intestine. Reflex sensation always follows parasympathetic fibers. However, the visceral afferents for pain nerve fibers can differ depending on if they are sensing above or below the pelvic pain line. This pelvic pain line represents the inferior limit of the peritoneum that extends into the pelvic cavity, and abdominopelvic organs can be either superior or inferior to this line. Now, recall that for structures above the pelvic pain line or in contact with the abdominal peritoneum, visceral afferents sensing pain travel with sympathetic fibers, whereas for structures below the pelvic pain line, typically subperitoneal pelvic viscera, visceral afferents sensing pain travel with the parasympathetic fibers. However, an exception to this is that the path of the visceral afferents sensing pain for the large intestine does not follow the pelvic pain line rule we just described, and instead the dividing line on whether pain travels with sympathetic versus parasympathetic is determined by a line going through the middle of the sigmoid colon instead of the pelvic pain line. Before we hit the recap, let's take a break and see if you can identify the main arteries of the large intestine. Alright, as a quick recap, the large intestine consists of the cecum, appendix, ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, and the rectum and anal canal. The ascending and descending colon and the rectum are retroperitoneal, while the cecum, transverse, and sigmoid colon are intraperitoneal. On the outside, the large intestine has omental appendices, Taenia coli, and haustra that differentiate it from the small intestine, as well as semilunar folds on the inside. The cecum has an ileal orifice and ileal papilla at the ileocolic junction and an opening for the base of the appendix. The large intestine is supplied from SMA and IMA via the ileocolic, left colic artery, middle colic artery, and right colic artery, sigmoid and superior rectal arteries. Veins follow arteries and have the same names as they do and eventually drain into the hepatic portal vein. Lymphatics drain into the nodes of the main arteries supplying the colon and eventually drain into the superior and inferior mesenteric nodes. Sympathetic innervation derives from the abdominopelvic splanchnic nerves, specifically the lesser splanchnic nerve, least splanchnic nerve, and lumbar splanchnic nerves, while the parasympathetic fibers derive from the vagus nerves or pelvic splanchnic nerves. Visceral afferent fibers transmitting pain from the large intestine follow sympathetic fibers above the middle of the sigmoid colon and parasympathetic fibers below the middle of the sigmoid colon. And remember, reflex sensation always follows parasympathetic fibers.
The liver is quite an amazing organ, and fact is, the rumors you heard are true. It can actually regenerate itself. If that wasn't enough, it also plays a major role in digestion by producing bile, storing energy, detoxifying toxic substances, and producing proteins. Let's get started and look more at the liver, along with the other associated organs and structures that help with digestion. The liver is a large intraperitoneal organ located mostly in the right hypochondriac and epigastric regions of the abdomen, deep to the 7th to 11th ribs. It sits just to the right of the stomach, with some of the liver covering its anterior surface. It is superior to the duodenum, right side of the transverse colon, and right colic flexure. Most of the liver is anterior to the lesser omentum, and it is anterosuperior to the right kidney and adrenal gland. The liver has many important functions, including the production of bile to aid in fat digestion, reception and metabolization of absorbed products from digestion, detoxification of toxic substances received from digestion, storage and release of carbohydrates, as well as the production of proteins, primarily plasma proteins such as albumin and clotting factors. When you look closely, the human liver is actually divided grossly into 4 parts, referred to as lobes. There is a larger right lobe, which is separated from a smaller left lobe by the falciform ligament. Then comes the caudate as well as the quadrate lobes, which are anatomically included in the right lobe. Now, the liver is surrounded by potential spaces, which are referred to as hepatic spaces. These spaces usually only contain a small amount of peritoneal fluid, which serves as a lubricant between two membranes in close contact. The hepatic spaces include the right and left subphrenic recesses, which are extensions of the peritoneal cavity located on the anterosuperior aspect of the liver, and are separated by the falciform ligament. Next is the subhepatic space, which is located between the liver and the transverse colon. This space connects with the hepatorenal recess, which extends posterosuperiorly from the subhepatic space between the liver and the right kidney. Alright, now let's look at the two main surfaces of the liver. First is the diaphragmatic surface, which is in direct contact with the diaphragm and is smooth and dome-shaped. Second is the visceral surface, which is an irregular surface molded by neighboring organs such as the gallbladder and the biliary ducts. The diaphragmatic surface is covered by visceral peritoneum except on its posterior aspect, which is known as the bare area. The bare area of the liver is in direct contact with the diaphragm. However, it's surrounded by reflections of the visceral peritoneum, which form the upper and lower layers of the coronary ligament. Coronary means crown, so this ligament surrounds the superior surface of the liver like a crown. These layers of the coronary ligament fuse together on the right to form the right triangular ligament, and on the left to form the left triangular ligament. The liver is divided into right and left lobes by the falciform ligament, which originates from the ventral mesentery of the embryological foregut. In its inferior free margin, this ligament contains the ligamentum teres hepatis, which translates as the round ligament of the liver. This is the remnant of the fetal umbilical vein, which used to carry oxygen-rich blood from the placenta to the fetal liver. Alright, now let's have a look at the grooves and impressions on the visceral surface of the liver created by the close contact with other organs. First, there are two remarkable grooves called the right and left sagittal fissures on the postero-inferior surface of the liver. These are connected by the porta hepatis, a short transverse fissure where most hepatic vessels enter and leave the liver. Together, they look a bit like the letter H. The right sagittal fissure contains a fossa for the gallbladder anteriorly, and it continues as the groove for the inferior vena cava along the posterior surface. The groove for the inferior vena cava also extends into the diaphragmatic surface of the liver. The left sagittal fissure, also known as the umbilical fissure, contains the fissure for the round ligament anteriorly and continues posteriorly with a fissure for the ligamentum venosum. The ligamentum venosum was actually called the ductus venosus during fetal life, and its role was to shunt blood from the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava, bypassing the fetal liver. Now, there is also the hepatogastric ligament, which is actually part of the lesser omentum that extends from the fissure of the ligamentum venosum to the lesser curvature of the stomach. The free edge of the lesser omentum, located postero-inferiorly to the right, is called the hepatoduodenal ligament, which extends between the porta hepatis and the proximal part of the duodenum. The hepatoduodenal ligament contains the portal triad, which consists of the bile duct, the hepatic artery proper, and the hepatic portal vein. Alright, let's now have a look at the blood supply of the liver. It receives blood from two major sources, the hepatic portal vein and the hepatic artery proper. The hepatic portal vein carries the majority of the blood that enters the liver. It results from the merging of the splenic and superior mesenteric veins, which carry nutrient-rich blood from the gastrointestinal tract. This blood goes straight to the liver, specifically the hepatocytes, which are the liver cells that carry out tasks such as detoxification. The remainder of the liver's blood supply is oxygen-rich arterial blood from the hepatic artery proper, which stems from a branch of the celiac trunk called the common hepatic artery. This artery then bifurcates into the gastroduodenal artery and the hepatic artery proper, which then also bifurcates into the right and left hepatic arteries. The right and left hepatic arteries mainly supply the non-parenchymal part of the liver, such as the bile ducts within the liver. Now let's talk about venous drainage of the liver. Within each hepatic lobule, blood flows from the periphery through sinusoids to a central vein. Blood from the central vein drains into a collecting vein, and then into one of three hepatic veins, and finally to the inferior vena cava. The right hepatic vein drains the right lobe of the liver. the left hepatic vein drains the left lobe, and the intermediate hepatic vein, which lies between these two lobes, drains the central part of the liver. Now let's move on to the liver's lymphatic drainage, which is generally divided anteriorly and posteriorly. Most of the lymphatic drainage from the anterior aspect of the liver drains into hepatic nodes around the porta hepatis, and from the posterior aspect into phrenic nodes around the bare area of the liver. Some lymph drainage may also occur along the falciform ligament and round ligament to the peristernal nodes and periumbilical nodes along the anterior abdominal wall. Finally, the liver's innervation is ensured by fibers from the hepatic plexus. The hepatic plexus receives sympathetic fibers from the celiac plexus and parasympathetic fibers from the anterior and posterior vagal trunks. Alright, now before we move on, press pause and recall the blood vessel that provides most of the liver's blood supply. Also, can you try to recall which artery the common hepatic artery originates from? Alright, now let's switch gears and have a look at the biliary tree, which consists of a series of ducts that carry bile from the liver and gallbladder to the duodenum. Bile is continuously secreted by hepatocytes, from where it drains via canaliculi into interlobular ducts, and then collecting ducts, which carry it to the left and right hepatic ducts. These hepatic ducts merge to form the common hepatic duct, which is subsequently joined by the cystic duct from the gallbladder to form the common bile duct. The cystic duct carries bile to and from the gallbladder, allowing bile storage and release. Inferiorly, the common bile duct merges with the main pancreatic duct, forming the hepatopancreatic ampulla, also called the ampulla of Vader. The hepatopancreatic ampulla opens into the duodenum at the major duodenal papilla. A muscular valve called the sphincter of Oddi regulates the flow of bile and pancreatic juice into the duodenum. Finally, let's have a look at the gallbladder, which is a pear-shaped intraperitoneal sac lying in a fossa on the visceral surface of the right lobe of the liver, lateral to the quadrate lobe and just anterosuperior to the duodenum. The gallbladder's main function is to concentrate and store bile produced by the liver, as well as release it after a meal that contains fats, to help with their digestion. The gallbladder has three parts: a rounded distal part called the fundus, the body, which is the largest part laying adjacent to the visceral surface of the liver, the transverse colon, and the upper part of the duodenum, and finally, the neck of the gallbladder, which is the tapering end where the cystic duct extends from. The mucosa of the neck of the gallbladder and the cystic duct creates a spiral fold also called the spiral valve, which helps to keep the cystic duct open to allow for the easy flow of bile for storage or release. The gallbladder's blood supply comes from the cystic artery, which is a branch of the right hepatic artery arising in the cystohepatic triangle of Callo. This triangle is a space bounded by the common hepatic duct, the cystic duct, and the visceral surface of the liver. Venous drainage from the neck of the gallbladder and the cystic duct is provided by cystic veins, which may enter the liver directly or empty into the hepatic portal vein. The veins draining the fundus and body of the gallbladder directly enter the visceral surface of the liver and empty into hepatic sinusoids. Lymph from the gallbladder drains to the cystic lymph nodes located at the gallbladder's neck. In turn, these nodes empty into the hepatic and the celiac lymph nodes. The gallbladder's sympathetic and sensory innervation is provided by the celiac plexus, while the vagal trunks contribute to this plexus, providing parasympathetic innervation. Before we recap, which two ducts come together to form the common bile duct? Alright, as a quick recap, the liver is an intraperitoneal organ located beneath the diaphragm within the right hypochondriac and epigastric regions. It has a left and right lobe separated by the falciform ligament, as well as a caudate and quadrate lobe, which are considered part of the right lobe. The majority of the liver's blood supply comes from the hepatic portal vein, while the remaining comes from the hepatic artery proper. Its venous drainage is provided by the left, right, and intermediate hepatic veins, while its nerve supply comes from the hepatic plexus, which includes fibers from anterior and posterior vagal trunks. The bile produced by the liver is drained through the left and right hepatic ducts, which join to form the common hepatic duct. Then the common hepatic duct is joined by the cystic duct from the gallbladder, forming the common bile duct. The common bile duct merges with the main pancreatic duct, forming the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which opens into the duodenum at the major duodenal papilla. Finally, the gallbladder is located on the inferior surface of the liver and consists of three parts: the fundus, the body, and the neck. The gallbladder is supplied by the cystic artery, drained by the cystic veins, and receives its innervation from the celiac plexus, which includes contributions from the vagal trunks.
Looking to learn about the kidneys and their associated organs? Well, you're in the right place. The kidneys are a pair of bean-shaped abdominal organs, which filter metabolic waste out of the blood in the form of urine. The urine then gets funneled into the urinary bladder by the ureters. Sitting on top of the kidneys, there are the suprarenal glands, or adrenal glands. These glands function as a part of the endocrine system by secreting adrenal hormones, which regulate various functions of the body. Let's begin with the kidneys, which are retroperitoneal organs, meaning they lie posterior to the peritoneum. They lie on the posterior abdominal wall, at the level of the T12 to L3 vertebrae, on both the right and left sides of the vertebral column. The right kidney sits slightly lower than the left one, which helps make space to accommodate the large size of the liver located on that side of the abdomen. Now, positioned superior to both kidneys are the suprarenal glands, but they also have a number of different relationships with surrounding organs. Anterior to the left kidney is a spleen, stomach, pancreas, left colic flexure, and jejunum, while the liver, duodenum, right colic flexure, and ascending colon lie anterior to the right kidney. The right kidney and liver are separated by the hepatorenal recess, also known as Morison's pouch. Posteriorly, both kidneys are associated with the diaphragm, the psoas major, quadratus lumborum, and transversus abdominis muscles, as well as a subcostal nerve and vessels, and the iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerves. The left kidney is also posteriorly associated with the 11th and 12th ribs, while the right is mainly associated with the 12th rib. Each kidney has a convex lateral margin and a concave medial margin. On their concave margins, each kidney has a vertical cleft, called the renal hilum, through which renal vessels, nerves, and the ureters enter and exit each kidney. At the renal hilum, the renal veins are positioned anteriorly and exit the hilum, draining filtered blood away from the kidney. Posterior to the renal veins are the renal arteries, which supply blood to the kidney. And posterior to the renal arteries is the renal pelvis, which is the superior portion of the ureters, which go on to deliver urine to the bladder. Now, the kidneys are surrounded by several layers of connective tissue and fat, which protect and cushion these delicate organs. When looking at a transverse section of the abdomen, there is a paranephric fat, which lies superficial to the renal fascia, and then deep through the renal fascia is a perinephric fat. Finally, deep to the perinephric fat is a renal capsule, which is a tough fibrous sheath that directly envelops the kidney. Now, let's take a look at the internal structure of a kidney in a coronal section. On the inside, each kidney consists of an outer renal cortex and an inner renal medulla. The functional units of the kidney are called nephrons, and different portions of these microscopic nephrons are found in both the renal cortex and medulla. Now, the renal cortex has extensions that project into the renal medulla, creating segments known as renal columns. These columns divide the medulla into pyramidal-shaped sections known as renal pyramids. The base of each renal pyramid is directed towards the cortex, and the apex, called the renal papilla, is directed towards the renal hilum. The renal papilla is where urine is excreted into a funnel-shaped structure called a minor calyx. Many minor calyces combine to form 2 or 3 major calyces, which in turn unite to form the renal pelvis, which is the expansion of the superior end of the ureter. The apex of the renal pelvis is continuous with the ureter. Okay, now remember that the main job of the kidneys is to filter the waste products out of our blood, which is then eliminated through the urine. To do this, blood is delivered to the kidneys by the renal arteries, which are direct branches of the abdominal aorta, emerging laterally at the level of the L1 to L2 vertebrae, just below the root of the superior mesenteric artery. Now, because the abdominal aorta is located slightly to the left of the spine, the right renal artery is slightly longer than the left, crossing posteriorly to the inferior vena cava to reach the right kidney. At the level of the hilum, each renal artery typically divides into a number of segmental arteries, each of which supplies a different renal segment. Venous blood leaves the kidneys via the renal veins, which drain straight into the inferior vena cava. The right renal vein exclusively drains the right kidney, while the left renal vein receives additional tributaries such as the left inferior phrenic vein, left suprarenal vein, and the left gonadal vein. As the left renal vein courses towards the inferior vena cava, it passes anterior to the abdominal aorta and posterior to the superior mesenteric artery. Now let's hit the pause button so we can have a quick quiz before we move on. From outside to inside, recall the layers of fat and fascia that surrounds the kidneys. Okay, now after urine is formed in the kidneys, it collects in the renal pelvis and leaves the kidneys through muscular tubes called the ureters, which carry the urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. The point where the ureters meet the renal pelvis is called the ureteropelvic junction. From there, the ureters then descend retroperitoneally in the abdomen, anterior to the psoas major muscle. When they reach the level of the sacroiliac joints, they cross the pelvic brim of the pelvic inlet and enter the pelvic cavity while also crossing anteriorly to the bifurcation of the common iliac arteries. Then, they turn anteromedially at the level of the ischial spines to enter the urinary bladder. Along the course of each ureter, there are 3 constriction points, which are common sites where kidney stones can get lodged and obstruct the urinary tract. The first constriction point is at the level of the ureteropelvic junction. The second constriction point is where the ureters cross the brim of the pelvic inlet and dive sharply into the pelvis. Finally, the last constriction is called the vesico-ureteric junction, which is where the ureters enter the wall of the urinary bladder. The ureters are supplied by a variety of adjacent vessels on their course towards the bladder. The proximal part of each ureter receives its blood supply from the renal arteries, while the middle part is supplied by branches of the abdominal aorta, gonadal arteries, and the common iliac arteries. The distal part of the ureter within the pelvis is supplied by branches from both the superior and inferior vesical arteries, which are branches of the internal iliac arteries. All arteries that reach the ureters divide into ascending and descending branches that form longitudinal anastomoses. Veins that drain the ureters accompany the arteries. So the renal veins drain the upper portion of the ureters, the gonadal veins drain the middle portion, while the vesicular veins drain the lower portion. Time for a pop quiz! Can you name the 3 constriction points of the ureters where renal stones can get lodged? Now, let's shift gears and talk about the suprarenal glands, which are a pair of endocrine glands that sit on the superior pole of each kidney. The main function of the suprarenal glands is to secrete steroid and catecholamine hormones. Steroid hormones like cortisol and aldosterone are involved in stress response and the control of fluid balance and ion homeostasis in the blood. The suprarenal glands also secrete catecholamines, namely epinephrine and norepinephrine. These hormones are secreted during our sympathetic fight or flight response, like if you were to run into a bear at your campsite, helping increase alertness, heart rate, breathing rate, and blood pressure. Now, the suprarenal glands are retroperitoneal organs. The right suprarenal gland is shaped like a pyramid, while the left suprarenal gland is more semilunar in shape. The suprarenal glands are closely related to a couple of other structures within the abdomen. Both the inferior vena cava and the right lobe of the liver lie anterior to the right suprarenal gland, while the right crus of the diaphragm lies posteriorly. The stomach, the pancreas, and the spleen lie anterior to the left suprarenal gland, while the left crus of the diaphragm lies posteriorly. Similarly to the kidneys, the suprarenal glands consist of an outer connective tissue capsule, an outer cortex, and an inner medulla. On a cross-section, we can identify these three main portions of the suprarenal gland. The suprarenal cortex is where steroid hormones like cortisol and androgens are produced, while catecholamines are produced in the suprarenal medulla. Now, the blood supply to the suprarenal glands is provided by three main arteries: the superior suprarenal artery arising from the inferior phrenic artery, the middle suprarenal artery arising from the abdominal aorta, and the inferior suprarenal arteries, which arises from the renal arteries. Venous blood leaves the suprarenal glands through the right suprarenal vein and left suprarenal vein. The right suprarenal vein drains directly into the inferior vena cava, whereas the left suprarenal vein drains into the left renal vein, which is often joined by the left inferior phrenic vein. Alright, now let's talk about the lymphatic drainage and innervation of the kidneys, ureters, and suprarenal glands. The lymph from both suprarenal glands, kidneys, and the upper ureters drains into the lateral aortic lymph nodes, while lymph from the lower ureters drains into the common external and internal iliac lymph nodes. The kidneys are innervated by the renal plexus, which consists of both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers from the thoracolumbar splanchnic nerves and the vagus nerve, respectively. The abdominal portion of the ureters receive their innervation from the ureteric plexus, which is supplied by fibers from the renal, the aortic, and the hypogastric plexuses. And finally, the suprarenal glands are innervated by fibers from the celiac plexus and thoracolumbar splanchnic nerves. Final quiz before we wrap this up. Can you recall which arteries supply the suprarenal glands and where they come from? Alright, as a quick recap. The kidneys are retroperitoneal organs located at the level of the T12 to L3 vertebrae. They're surrounded by several layers of connective tissue and fat. From superficial to deep, these are the paranephric fat, the renal fascia, the perinephric fat, and the fibrous renal capsule. Renal vessels, nerves, as well as the ureters enter or leave the kidneys through the renal hilum, which is located on the medial side of each kidney. The ureters are muscular tubes extending from the distal part of the renal pelvis to the urinary bladder. Finally, the suprarenal glands are made up of a tough outer capsule, a cortex, and innermost medulla. The cortex secretes steroid hormones, while the medulla secretes catecholamines.
Most of our abdominal organs, also called abdominal viscera, are part of the digestive system. These include the stomach, the small and large intestine, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. The abdomen is also home to other organs like the spleen, kidneys, suprarenal glands, and the ureters, which play important roles in other systems. All of these organs work involuntarily, so they're innervated by the autonomic nervous system. And luckily so. Can you imagine trying to voluntarily control digesting each vegetable in a salad? Okay, now remember that our nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Functionally, the peripheral nervous system is also divided into two parts: the somatic nervous system controlling the voluntary movement of skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system that controls the involuntary movement of the smooth muscles and also the glands of our organs or viscera. Now, the autonomic nervous system is also divided into two parts: the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response. It increases heart rate and breathing rate while slowing down digestion through reducing peristalsis and constricting blood vessels to the gut to reduce blood flow. The parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest response, and it slows down heart rate and increases digestion by promoting peristalsis, gland secretion, and dilation of gut vessels for increased blood flow. Alright, now press pause and see if you can tell whether the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system promotes digestion. Let's take a deep dive by first looking at the sympathetic nervous system, which consists of the abdominopelvic splanchnic nerves, prevertebral ganglia, the abdominal aortic plexuses and their extensions, the periarterial plexuses. Splanchnic nerves mean nerves for the internal organs, so they innervate the abdominal viscera. Abdominopelvic splanchnic nerves contain sympathetic fibers, which arise from cell bodies in the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, from T5 to L2 or L3 spinal segments. The fibers first pass through the anterior roots, the anterior rami, and the white rami communicantes of the thoracic and upper lumbar spinal nerves. Then they reach the chain of paravertebral ganglia, which are the sympathetic ganglia lying close to the spine, which are linked to form the sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic fibers pass through the paravertebral ganglia without synapsing, and they enter the different abdominopelvic splanchnic nerves, which carry these fibers to the prevertebral ganglia in the abdomen. There are two major groups of abdominopelvic splanchnic nerves based on which part of the sympathetic trunk they arise from. These are the lower thoracic splanchnic nerves, which arise from the thoracic part of the sympathetic trunk, and the lumbar splanchnic nerves, which arise from the abdominal part of the sympathetic trunk. Let's first look at the sympathetic pathway for the lower thoracic splanchnic nerves, which enter the abdominal cavity by piercing through the crus of the diaphragm. These nerves carry their preganglionic fibers to different ganglia located along the aortic plexuses, which are networks of nerve fibers overlying the abdominal aorta. The greater splanchnic nerves, arising from T5 to T9, carry their fibers to the celiac ganglia, which are located near the celiac arterial trunk. The lesser splanchnic nerves, which arise from T10 through T11, and the least splanchnic nerves, which arise from T12, synapse in the aortico-renal ganglia, which are located on either side of the superior mesenteric artery, and the superior mesenteric ganglion located just superior to the superior mesenteric artery. After synapsing, the postganglionic fibers travel along the periarterial plexuses to their target organs. Postganglionic fibers from the celiac ganglia travel along the plexus on the arterial branches from the celiac trunk, and they mainly provide sympathetic innervation to the foregut, meaning the stomach, and the proximal part of the duodenum. These fibers also innervate the liver, the gallbladder, pancreas, and spleen. Now, the postganglionic fibers from the superior mesenteric ganglion provide sympathetic innervation to the midgut, that is, the part of the gut from the distal parts of the duodenum through the proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon, including the small intestine. The postganglionic fibers from the aortico-renal ganglion provide the sympathetic innervation to the kidneys, and some preganglionic fibers travel through this ganglion to the adrenal medulla, where they synapse directly with the cells within it. Next up are the lumbar splanchnic nerves, which carry the sympathetic fibers from the abdominal part of the sympathetic trunk, which is from the L1 to L2 or L3 spinal segments. Preganglionic fibers of the lumbar splanchnic nerves synapse in the inferior mesenteric ganglion. Postganglionic fibers emerging from this ganglion provide sympathetic innervation to the hindgut, which is the transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and rectum. Now for a quick break. Can you remember where the greater splanchnic nerve synapses? Alright, now let's get into the rest and digest mood and talk about the parasympathetic innervation of the abdominal viscera, which comes from the anterior and posterior vagal trunks and the pelvic splanchnic nerves. The anterior and the posterior vagal trunks are the continuation of the left and the right vagus nerves that emerge from the esophageal plexus. They enter the abdominal cavity through the esophageal hiatus in the diaphragm, carrying preganglionic parasympathetic fibers through the abdominal aortic plexuses, the periarterial plexuses, and finally synapse in the enteric ganglia, which are located on or within the organs. The vagus nerves in the abdomen supply parasympathetic innervation to the lower esophagus, stomach, small intestine, ascending colon, and most of the transverse colon. The pelvic splanchnic nerves carry parasympathetic innervation to the final part of the gut, from the descending colon to the anus. Preganglionic fibers of the pelvic splanchnic nerves originate from the S2 to S4 spinal segments and travel to the inferior hypogastric plexuses without synapsing. From here, these fibers travel through the periarterial plexuses to synapse in the enteric ganglia of the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and pelvic organs. Now let's have a look at the sensory innervation of the abdominal viscera, which consists of afferent fibers carrying visceral sensory information from the organs to the spinal cord. Visceral afferent fibers for the abdominal viscera, up to the midpoint of the sigmoid colon, travel alongside sympathetic efferent fibers in the lower thoracic and lumbar splanchnic nerves, but in the opposite direction. This means that an impulse starts from the sensory receptors of a particular visceral organ, then passes along the splanchnic nerves to the sympathetic trunk, from where it moves through the white rami communicantes to the anterior rami of the spinal nerves. At this level, afferent fibers diverge from the regular course of the sympathetic fibers, because instead of taking the anterior route pathway, they pass through the posterior route to get into the spinal cord. Depending on the organ, pain stimuli are carried to different spinal cord segments. Pain stimuli from the foregut is primarily carried to the T6 to T9 spinal cord segments. The midgut travels to the levels of T8 to T12, and the hindgut to the T12 to L2 levels. Finally, visceral afferent fibers from the midpoint of the sigmoid colon onwards run with the parasympathetic fibers of the pelvic splanchnic nerves to relay to the S2 to S4 spinal cord segments. Reflex stimuli from the abdominal viscera up to the transverse colon travel with the vagus nerves, and those from the transverse colon onwards travel with the pelvic splanchnic nerves. Now, as sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers run in the abdominal cavity, they form networks of nerves clustered along the course of the abdominal aorta and its major branches, called abdominal autonomic plexuses. Major abdominal autonomic plexuses include the celiac plexus, which surrounds the celiac arterial trunk. It has two celiac ganglia in it and is composed of both the sympathetic fibers from the lower thoracic splanchnic nerves and the parasympathetic fibers from the vagus nerves. Next is the superior mesenteric plexus, which surrounds the superior mesenteric artery and has one or more superior mesenteric ganglia in it. Just inferior lies the intermesenteric plexus, which is located between the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Surrounding the inferior mesenteric artery is the inferior mesenteric plexus, where an inferior mesenteric ganglion may also be found. At the bifurcation of the aorta lies another plexus called the superior hypogastric plexus. It is followed by two more in the pelvis, the left and the right inferior hypogastric plexuses, which are connected to the superior hypogastric plexuses by the left and right hypogastric nerves. One last pause before we recap. Can you try to remember which nerves provide parasympathetic innervation to the abdominal viscera? Alright, as a quick recap, abdominal viscera are innervated by the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic innervation is provided by the lower thoracic splanchnic nerves, consisting of the greater splanchnic nerve, lesser splanchnic nerve, least splanchnic nerve, and lumbar splanchnic nerves. The parasympathetic innervation is provided by the vagus nerve and the pelvic splanchnic nerves. Nerve fibers from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems create networks around the abdominal aorta called aortic plexuses or abdominal autonomic plexuses. Major abdominal autonomic plexuses are the celiac plexus, the superior mesenteric plexus, the intermesenteric plexus, and the inferior mesenteric plexus. There is also the superior hypogastric plexus and the two inferior hypogastric plexuses. Visceral afferent fibers from the abdominal organs up to the midpoint of the sigmoid colon run retrogradely with sympathetic fibers in the lower thoracic and lumbar splanchnic nerves. The visceral afferent fibers from the midpoint of the sigmoid colon onwards run with parasympathetic fibers to the S2 through S4 sensory ganglia. Lastly, the reflex fibers from the abdominal organs up to the transverse colon travel with the vagus nerves, and those from the transverse colon onwards travel with the pelvic splanchnic nerves.
Osmosis knows that anatomy can be overwhelming, but hopefully this video on the esophagus and stomach can make it a bit easier. So let's begin digesting this content together. The esophagus and the stomach are part of the upper digestive tract and are involved in the first phases of digestion. We are going to use the pizza we ate for dinner last night as an example to help us explore the pathway of the esophagus and stomach. Now let's start with the esophagus, which is a muscular tube that carries food from the pharynx to the stomach. We can think about the esophagus as a subway that our food travels in between these two structures. After the pizza we ate has been chewed and swallowed, the muscles of the esophagus help propel the bolus towards the stomach in a wave-like motion called peristalsis. The esophagus is made up of two muscular layers, an internal circular layer and an external longitudinal layer. In its proximal or superior third, the external layer consists of striated skeletal muscle, which is under voluntary control, while its distal or inferior third is made up of smooth muscle, which is under involuntary control. And as you'd expect, the middle third is a transitional segment that consists of a mix of both types of muscle. The esophagus follows the curve of the vertebral column as it descends through the neck and into the mediastinum. Once it reaches the diaphragm, it passes through the esophageal hiatus just to the left of the median plane at the level of the T10 vertebra, where it becomes the abdominal esophagus. The abdominal esophagus finishes its journey by becoming continuous with the stomach through the cardial orifice, which is surrounded by the cardiac sphincter. It sits left of the midline at the level of the T11 vertebra and designates the esophago-gastric junction, which is an important landmark where the mucosa abruptly changes from the stratified squamous epithelium of the esophagus to the simple columnar epithelium of the stomach. The right border of the abdominal esophagus continues with the lesser curvature of the stomach, while its left border will eventually continue with the fundus of the stomach. There are also important points along the length of the esophagus where there are natural constrictions. These constrictions of the esophagus are caused by four structures passing the esophagus as it descends in the cervical, thoracic, and diaphragmatic regions. Now, to better visualize the esophagus and these constrictions, a barium swallow study can be performed which uses an X-ray imaging technique called fluoroscopy. The cervical constriction, also known as the upper esophageal sphincter, is located at the pharyngoesophageal junction and is caused by the cricopharyngeus muscle. The thoracic or bronchoaortic constriction can occur at 2 points where the esophagus is first crossed by the arch of the aorta and then where it's crossed by the left main bronchus. Lastly, the diaphragmatic constriction is where the esophagus passes through the esophageal hiatus of the diaphragm, with the diaphragm actually contributing to the lower esophageal sphincter. These esophageal constrictions are areas where food can potentially get stuck. Now let's talk about blood supply. Proximally, the esophagus is supplied by branches of the inferior thyroid arteries. As we move distally, branches of the bronchial arteries and branches coming directly from the thoracic aorta supply the thoracic esophagus. The arterial supply of the abdominal esophagus is provided by the left gastric artery, which is a branch of the celiac trunk, and the left inferior phrenic artery. The venous drainage of the thoracic esophagus occurs via the inferior thyroid vein and tributaries of the azygous vein. The venous drainage of the abdominal esophagus has two routes: to the hepatic portal venous system through the left gastric vein, and into the systemic venous system through esophageal veins entering the azygous vein. The lymphatic drainage of the esophagus is divided into thirds. The superior third drains into deep cervical lymph nodes, the middle third into superior and posterior mediastinal lymph nodes, and the inferior third into the left gastric lymph nodes. Lastly, let's discuss the innervation of the esophagus. It receives parasympathetic fibers from the right and left vagus nerves and sympathetic fibers from the sympathetic trunks. The vagus nerves go on to form the esophageal plexus, which also contains sympathetic fibers mainly from the greater splanchnic nerves that arise from the sympathetic trunk at the T5 to T9 level. Its fibers synapse along the aorta, including at the celiac ganglia, before contributing to the esophageal plexus. Let's take a quick break and try to identify the 4 anatomical areas of constrictions in the esophagus. Now, let's move on to the stomach, the next stop for our bite of pizza after its journey through the esophagus. The stomach acts as a reservoir for ingested food like our piece of pizza, and prepares it for digestion with the help of enzymes and gastric juice, which gradually converts solid food into a semi-liquid mixture called chyme. We can think about the stomach as our own endogenous food blender. Now, the size, shape, and position of the stomach can vary from person to person and may change even in the same person during movements such as respiration and body position. When lying supine, the stomach can occupy parts of the epigastric region, umbilical region, left hypochondriac region, and left lumbar region of the abdomen. On the other hand, when sitting upright, the stomach will move slightly inferior. Now that we understand what the stomach does and its position within the body, let's dig into the external anatomical features of the stomach. The stomach has 4 parts: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pyloric part, along with 2 curvatures, the lesser curvature and the greater curvature. The cardia is the part surrounding the cardial orifice, which is the superior opening of the stomach and where the esophagus connects to the stomach. The cardia is located at the level of the T11 vertebra. The fundus is the dilated superior portion of the stomach and is related to the left dome of the diaphragm. Between the fundus and the esophagus, there's a deep notch called the cardial notch. The body of the stomach comprises the major portion of the stomach and is located between the fundus and the pyloric antrum. The pyloric portion of the stomach is a funnel-shaped region which has a wider part called the pyloric antrum and a narrow part called the pyloric canal. Distally, it has a sphincteric region called the pylorus, which is a marked thickening of the circular layer of smooth muscle that controls passage of the stomach contents through the pyloric orifice into the duodenum. In a supine position, the pyloric part is located at the level of the transpyloric plane, located at the L1 vertebra midway between the jugular notch superiorly and the pubic crest inferiorly, while in a standing position, its location varies from the L2 through L4 vertebra. The lesser curvature of the stomach forms the shorter, concave right border of the stomach, which is continuous with the right side of the esophagus superiorly. The greater curvature forms the longer, convex left border of the stomach, which passes inferiorly and curves medially to reach the pyloric antrum. Because of the unequal lengths of the 2 curvatures, the stomach is shaped like the letter J. Let's take another break and try to identify the parts of the stomach as well as the 2 curvatures. Now, let's talk about the internal features of the stomach. The interior of the stomach is covered by a mucus layer that protects its surface from the gastric acid secreted by the stomach's glands. When the gastric mucosa contracts, it forms longitudinal wrinkles called gastric folds or gastric rugae, which are most obvious toward the pyloric part and along the greater curvature. These gastric rugae will diminish and disappear when the stomach fills and distends, which is often the case when that one bite of pizza actually turns into eating the entire pizza. Superficial to the gastric mucosa is the muscularis externa, which consists of 3 muscular sublayers. From internal to external, these are called the oblique layer, circular layer, and longitudinal layer. These layers of smooth muscle work together to cause movement and contractions within the stomach to help churn the stomach contents necessary to digest our piece of pizza. It is also important to understand the anatomical position of the stomach in relation to all of the other organs and structures that surround and cover it. The stomach is mostly covered by visceral peritoneum. The lesser omentum is a small, double-layered peritoneal fold extending from the lesser curvature of the stomach and proximal duodenum to the liver. The greater omentum is actually a 4-layered peritoneal fold that extends from the greater curvature of the stomach and hangs down, covering the intestines like a blanket. Now, the anterior surface of the stomach is in close proximity to the diaphragm, the left lobe of the liver, and the anterior abdominal wall, where the posterior surface of the stomach is in close proximity to the pancreas inferiorly, the spleen laterally, and the transverse colon inferolaterally, which runs along the greater curvature to the left colic flexure. Furthermore, the stomach can also be used as a division between the two main compartments of the peritoneal cavity, the greater sac and the lesser sac, the latter of which is also known as the omental bursa. The greater sac is the larger compartment of the peritoneal cavity and lies anterior to the stomach, whereas the lesser sac lies posterior to the stomach and lesser omentum and is a sac-like cavity that allows movement of the stomach over the structures posterior to it. Also remember, the greater sac and lesser sac communicate with each other through the omental foramen, an opening posterior to the free edge of the lesser omentum. Okay, let's move on to the arterial supply of the stomach, which is provided by branches of the celiac trunk. The lesser curvature is supplied by the left gastric artery and right gastric artery, and the greater curvature is supplied by the left and right gastro-omental or gastroepiploic arteries. Along these curvatures, the two gastric arteries and the two gastro-omental arteries will form anastomoses with each other. The fundus and the upper body are supplied by the short gastric arteries and posterior gastric arteries. Now, the veins are easy to remember as they mirror the arteries of the stomach. All of the venous blood from the stomach ultimately drains into the hepatic portal vein. The left gastric vein and the right gastric vein drain directly into the hepatic portal vein, while the short gastric veins and the left gastro-omental vein drain into the splenic vein that joins with the superior mesenteric vein to form the hepatic portal vein. The right gastro-omental vein also drains directly into the superior mesenteric vein. Lymph from the stomach mainly drains to the nodes located along the lesser and greater curvature and can be organized as coming from the upper 2/3 and lower third of the stomach. Most of the upper 2/3 of the stomach drains to the gastric lymph nodes, with lymph from the fundus and superior part of the body of the stomach also draining to the pancreatico-splenic nodes. Lymph from the lower third, closer to the lesser curvature, drain to the pyloric nodes, where the inferior third, closer to the greater curvature, drain to the pancreatico-duodenal lymph nodes. The lymph from all these nodes will mainly drain to the celiac nodes. Time for another break. Try to identify the arteries of the stomach. Now, let's talk about the innervation of the stomach. The parasympathetic innervation of the stomach is from the anterior vagal trunk and posterior vagal trunk and their branches. The anterior vagal trunk sends branches to the anterior surface of the stomach, liver, and duodenum. It emerges from the esophageal plexus and is formed mainly by the left vagus nerve. The posterior vagal trunk sends branches to the posterior surface of the stomach. It emerges from the esophageal plexus and is formed mainly by the right vagus nerve. The sympathetic innervation of the stomach is provided from the T6 to T9 segments of the spinal cord, with fibers traveling to the abdomen within the greater splanchnic nerves to synapse in the celiac ganglia before they go on to innervate the stomach. Alright, let's finish up with a quick recap. The esophagus is a muscular tube that carries food from the pharynx to the stomach. It has two layers of muscles, an internal circular layer and an external longitudinal layer. The esophagus has 4 anatomical constrictions where food is more likely to become stuck: 1 cervical constriction, 2 thoracic constrictions, and 1 diaphragmatic constriction. The stomach is an important part of the digestive tract, located between the esophagus and the small intestine. It has 4 parts: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pyloric part, along with 2 curvatures, the lesser curvature and the greater curvature. The arterial supply of the stomach is provided by the celiac trunk and its branches, such as the left gastric artery and right gastric artery, the left and right gastro-omental arteries, the short gastric arteries, and the posterior gastric arteries. The venous drainage is provided by the left gastric vein and right gastric vein, the short gastric veins, the left gastro-omental vein, and right gastro-omental vein. The parasympathetic innervation of the stomach is provided by branches of the anterior and posterior vagal trunks, while the sympathetic innervation of the stomach is through the greater splanchnic nerves from the T6 to T9 spinal cord levels.
The gastrointestinal tract is essentially a long tube extending from our mouth to our rectum. We rely on it to eat, break down our food, and turn it into, well, you get the picture. Due to its role in breakdown and absorption of nutrients, it's important to understand the different divisions and blood supply of the gastrointestinal tract. The abdominal section of the gastrointestinal tract develops from three embryological structures called the primordial foregut, midgut, and hindgut. And in turn, the foregut, midgut, and hindgut all derive from the three embryonic germ layers, the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. The mesoderm is what forms the peritoneum, which either completely or partially lines the organs of the peritoneal cavity, including the gastrointestinal tract. It's important to understand these different embryological divisions, as the foregut, midgut, and hindgut each have their own unique blood supply. The foregut extends from the esophagus to the duodenum at the level of the major duodenal papilla, where the pancreatic and common bile duct insert, and it consists of the esophagus, stomach, the proximal duodenum, as well as the liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and spleen. The midgut extends from the distal portion of the duodenum to the last third of the transverse colon. It consists of the distal duodenum, jejunum, ileum, cecum, appendix, ascending colon, and proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon. Finally, the hindgut extends from the distal third of the transverse colon to the anal canal, above the pectinate line. It consists of the distal portion of the transverse colon, descending colon, and sigmoid colon, and rectum. Now remember that organs with the same embryologic origin share the same arterial supply, which primarily comes from the abdominal aorta and its single anterior branches, the celiac trunk for the foregut, the superior mesenteric artery for the midgut, and the inferior mesenteric artery for the hindgut. The celiac trunk arises from the anterior wall of the abdominal aorta at the level of the 12th thoracic vertebra and the aortic hiatus of the diaphragm. It has a short course, going anteriorly and inferiorly for less than 2 centimeters before branching into 3 arteries, the left gastric, splenic, and common hepatic arteries. The left gastric artery ascends where it gives the esophageal branch, which supplies the distal portion of the esophagus. Then, it curves downwards along the lesser curvature and within the lesser omentum, giving smaller branches that supply the anterior and posterior walls of the stomach, and it also anastomoses with the right gastric artery. The splenic artery travels to the left within the splenorenal ligament, a ligamentous connection between the spleen and left kidney, along the superior border of the pancreas, and it gives branches for the body of the pancreas, a posterior gastric branch, and a branch for the hilum of the spleen. At the hilum of the spleen, the splenic artery gives short gastric arteries for the fundus of the stomach, and the left gastro-omental or gastroepiploic artery. That descends along the greater curvature of the stomach and supplies the wall adjacent to it. Finally, the common hepatic artery goes towards the porta hepatis, which is a small but deep transverse fissure through which all the neurovascular structures of the liver pass. The common hepatic artery separates into 2 main branches. The first branch is the gastroduodenal artery that descends behind the first part of the duodenum and gives two more major branches. First is the right gastroomental or gastroepiploic artery, which enters the greater omentum and passes along the greater curvature of the stomach to supply its walls and to anastomose with the left gastroomental artery. The second branch is the superior pancreatico-duodenal artery, which soon divides into anterior and posterior branches that descend in front and behind the head of the pancreas, respectively. These branches supply the head of the pancreas as well as the proximal part of the duodenum. After giving the duodenal artery, the common hepatic artery continues as a hepatic artery proper, and on its way to the liver, it gives the right gastric artery. This artery runs along the lesser curvature of the stomach, supplying its walls and anastomosing with the left gastric artery. Finally, the hepatic artery proper branches into the left and right hepatic arteries, which supply the liver. The right hepatic artery also gives a branch called the cystic artery that goes within the hepatoduodenal ligament to supply the gallbladder and cystic duct. So, in essence, the celiac trunk, through its branches, supplies all the structures of the foregut. Let's take a quick break and try to identify the main branches of the celiac trunk, as well as the regions that they supply. Moving on down the abdominal aorta, at the level of the L1 vertebra and about 1 centimeter inferior to the celiac trunk, is the superior mesenteric artery, or SMA. The SMA branches from the abdominal aorta posterior to the neck of the pancreas, and as it travels inferiorly, it emerges anteriorly and medially to the uncinate process of the pancreas. It also crosses anterior to the left renal vein and the third part of the duodenum. The SMA runs through the layers of the mesentery and goes towards the ileocecal junction in the right lower quadrant, giving many intestinal branches along the way. The first one is usually the inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery that gives anterior and posterior branches to the duodenum and anastomose with the anterior and posterior branches of the superior pancreatico-duodenal artery of the celiac trunk. Then, the SMA gives around 15 to 18 intestinal branches to the jejunum and ileum. These adjacent intestinal branches form anastomoses with each other that look like loops, called the arterial arcades. From these arcades arise many straight arteries, called the vasa recta, that supply and penetrate the intestines. Branches for the jejunum have fewer and larger arcades with longer vasa recta, while the ileum has more arcades with shorter loops and shorter vasa recta. Next, the SMA gives off the ileocholic artery, which supplies the cecum and parts of the terminal ileum and ascending colon. It also gives the appendicular artery that goes within the mesoappendix and supplies the appendix. The SMA also gives rise to the right cholic artery that travels retroperitoneally to supply the ascending colon. Lastly, the SMA gives off the middle cholic artery, which ascends retroperitoneally within the transverse mesocolon to supply the transverse colon. Last but not least, going back to the abdominal aorta now, the inferior mesenteric artery, or IMA, arises at the level of the L3 vertebra, from the anterior wall of the abdominal aorta. The IMA gives off the left cholic artery that goes retroperitoneally to the left and supplies the descending colon. Next are the sigmoid arteries that travel within the sigmoid mesocolon to supply the sigmoid colon, as well as a part of the descending colon through anastomoses with the left cholic artery. The last branch of the IMA is the superior rectal artery that supplies the proximal part of the rectum via the left and right branches that follow it retroperitoneally into the pelvis. Some of its branches anastomose with the sigmoid arteries as well. Let's take another break and see if you can identify the main branches of the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Now, looking at the blood supply of the whole large intestines, from the cecum to the rectum, we can see that all adjacent major arteries, including the ileocholic, right, middle, left colic, and sigmoid arteries, share anastomoses with each other. This gives rise to the marginal artery, which runs the entire length of the colon close to the mesenteric border, and provides adequate blood supply for the colon. Specifically, the right colic and middle colic artery anastomose to supply the right colic flexure, and the middle colic artery connects to the left colic artery to supply the left colic flexure. This anastomosis at the left colic flexure marks the connection between the SMA and IMA, allowing the marginal artery to provide continuous blood supply to the intestines from both SMA and IMA in the event of reduced blood flow in either one of these arteries. Finally, the rectum is supplied by 3 different types of arteries: the superior, middle, and inferior rectal arteries. The superior rectal artery arises from the IMA and supplies the proximal part of the rectum. The middle rectal arteries arise from the internal iliac arteries and supply the middle and distal parts of the rectum. The inferior rectal arteries arise from the internal pudendal arteries and supply the distal part of the rectum, anorectal junction, and anal canal. Finally, the superior, middle, and inferior rectal arteries can also form an anastomosis with each other. Now, let's switch gears and look at the venous drainage of the abdominal viscera. First, let's discuss how there's both a systemic venous drainage system and a portal venous drainage system. The systemic venous system occurs when venous blood drains from a single capillary bed and has a direct course to drain into either the inferior or superior vena cava, which returns blood to the right atrium. In contrast, a portal venous system occurs when blood travels through 2 different capillary beds, which is what venous blood from the small and large intestines do. So venous blood from the small and large intestines drains into the superior mesenteric vein and the inferior mesenteric vein through their first capillary bed in the intestines. These veins, along with the splenic vein, come together to drain into the hepatic portal vein, which is part of the portal venous system, and goes on to drain into the liver. The hepatic portal vein allows nutrient venous blood from the small and large intestines to filter through the liver to be absorbed and processed before entering the systemic venous system. Therefore, this blood first drains from the capillary bed of the intestines into the hepatic portal vein as a part of the portal venous system to the liver, then filters into a specialized secondary capillary bed known as the liver sinusoids. From here, blood drains into the central veins of the liver, which ultimately drain into the hepatic veins and subsequent IVC as part of the systemic venous system. Regarding the anatomy of the hepatic portal vein specifically, this vein arises when the superior mesenteric vein and splenic vein merge around the level of the L1 vertebra and transpyloric plane, behind the neck of the pancreas and in front of the inferior vena cava. The inferior mesenteric vein contributes to the portal system as well, most commonly draining in the splenic vein, but may sometimes drain into the superior mesenteric vein instead. Less commonly, it can drain directly into the junction of the superior mesenteric and splenic veins. Alright, as a quick recap. The primordial foregut gives rise to the esophagus, stomach, proximal duodenum to the level of the major duodenal papilla, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and spleen. The midgut gives rise to the distal duodenum, jejunum, ileum, cecum, appendix, ascending colon, and proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon. The hindgut gives rise to the distal third of the transverse colon, descending and sigmoid colon, and rectum. The foregut is supplied by the celiac trunk, which comes off at the level of T12 and gives off the left gastric artery, the splenic artery, and the common hepatic artery. The midgut is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery that arises from the abdominal aorta at the level of L1 and crosses the left renal vein and third part of the duodenum. The SMA gives the inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery, intestinal arteries that form arterial arcades, the ileocolic artery, the appendicular artery from it, as well as the right and middle colic arteries. The inferior mesenteric artery arises from the abdominal aorta at the level of L3 and gives the left colic artery, sigmoid arteries, and the superior rectal artery. Along the colon, arteries anastomose as well, forming the marginal artery that connects to SMA and IMA. Venous blood from these organs is collected into the superior mesenteric vein, inferior mesenteric vein, and the splenic vein that together form the hepatic portal vein that drains into the liver. The inferior mesenteric vein drains into the splenic vein, or, less likely, into the superior mesenteric vein.
Our central nervous system is made up of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, which continues inferiorly with the spinal cord. The cerebrum consists of two cerebral hemispheres, which have an external cerebral cortex made up of nuclei, which form the gray matter, and deep to that, the white matter consisting of axons. Embedded within the white matter, there are the basal ganglia, or basal nuclei. Removing them reveals a part of the brain hidden between the hemispheres called the diencephalon. Together, the cerebrum and diencephalon form the forebrain, or prosencephalon. The diencephalon connects the cerebrum superiorly with the midbrain of the brainstem inferiorly. On a mid-sagittal section through the brain, we can see the cavity of the third ventricle and the diencephalon around it. The two major parts of the diencephalon are the thalamus, which lies more dorsally, and the hypothalamus, which lies more ventrally. There are actually two thalami, one on each side, flanking the lateral aspect of the space created by the third ventricle. Between the left and right thalami, there's a bridge of gray matter that connects them, called the interthalamic adhesion, or connection. The hypothalamus forms the inferior part of the lateral wall and the floor of the third ventricle. Between the thalamus and the hypothalamus, there's the hypothalamic sulcus, which separates them. The diencephalon contains two endocrine glands as well, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland below the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland near the caudal end of the thalamus. Okay, let's take a closer look at the thalamus first, which is an egg-shaped structure made of gray matter that contains neuronal cell bodies. The thalamus is connected with almost all parts of the central nervous system, like the brainstem and the cerebral cortex, enabling it to influence many different processes in the brain. In fact, the thalamus is a part of almost every sensory pathway, where it serves as a major relay station that gathers, combines, and processes afferent information before forwarding it to the cerebral cortex. This way, the thalamus can recognize that there is a hot object in our hands, but without the cortex, it cannot process more detailed information, like the shape and weight of the object, or compare it to previous experiences. The only sensory pathway that doesn't relay through the thalamus is the olfactory system, which enables us to smell. The thalamus plays a role in modulating movement through its connections with the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and frontal lobe. It can also influence motivated behaviors via connections between the hypothalamus and the frontal lobe. The thalamus can even alter levels of consciousness by communicating with the reticular formation of the brainstem. Talk about multitasking. Now, to better understand its relation to adjacent structures, let's make a transverse section of the brain. Medial to the thalamus, there's the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Anterior to the thalamus, there's the interventricular foramen, or foramen of Monroe, through which the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. Lateral to the thalamus, there's the posterior limb of the internal capsule, while the posterior part of the thalamus, called the pulvinar, is not covered by other structures and can be seen superior to the posterior aspect of the midbrain. Now let's switch to a coronal section of the brain. Here we can see that the dorsal surface of the thalamus is free, sitting under the lateral ventricle and the fornix, while ventrally there's the tegmentum of the midbrain. Like on the transverse plane, the third ventricle lies medially and the internal capsule lies laterally. Switching to the sagittal plane, once again inside the third ventricle, we can see the medial surface of the thalamus and the interthalamic adhesion arising from it. Now let's take out the thalamus and zoom in on its superior surface. The first structure here is the internal medullary lamina, which is a layer of white matter that looks like the letter Y and divides the thalamus into three parts: medial, lateral, and anterior. The gray matter of each part contains the various thalamic nuclei. Some of the most important nuclei of the lateral part are the ventral posterolateral nucleus, the ventral posteromedial nucleus, and the ventral lateral nucleus. The ventral posterolateral, or VPL nucleus, receives input from the medial lemniscus and the spinothalamic tract and projects to the primary somatosensory cortex. In order to easily remember sensations that this nucleus transmits, you can remember that for VPL, V in ventral stands for the vibration, P in posterior for pain, pressure, and proprioception, L in lateral for the light touch, then just add the temperature. The ventral posteromedial, or VPM nucleus, receives input from the trigeminal and gustatory pathways and projects to the primary somatosensory cortex as well. To remember the sensations that this nucleus transmits, you can use the mnemonic, makeup goes on the face. The M in makeup refers to the ventral posteromedial nucleus, while the face refers to somatosensations from the face as well as taste. The ventral lateral nucleus receives input from the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, and it projects to the motor and premotor regions of the cerebral cortex. This nucleus relays motor information and can influence movements. The last two nuclei are the medial and lateral geniculate bodies. The medial geniculate body is a small bulge under the posterior end of the pulvinar. It receives input from the inferior colliculus via the inferior brachium and from the superior olivary complex, and then projects to the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe. To remember that it is involved in hearing, you can say the M in medial stands for music. Lateral to the medial geniculate body is another small bulge called the lateral geniculate body. It receives input from the retina via the optic nerve, optic chiasm, and optic tract, and then projects to the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe via the optic radiation. To remember that it transmits visual information, you can say the L in lateral stands for light. Let's take a short break and see if you can identify the main nuclei of the thalamus. Good. Now let's switch gears and have a closer look at the hypothalamus. Even though it's small, the hypothalamus is like a mastermind of the brain, as it regulates homeostasis, which is the state of the body where conditions are optimal for internal processes to function properly. The hypothalamus achieves this by receiving various inputs, like visceral or somatic afferents, information related to the special senses, as well as input from the cerebral cortex and the limbic system. Using neural, blood, and CSF connections, the hypothalamus can regulate a number of processes, which you can remember using the TAN-HATS mnemonic: thirst and water intake, endocrine organs and hormone secretion of the pituitary gland, which consists of the adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis, hunger and food intake, the autonomic nervous system, temperature, and sexual drive and emotional expression. Now, just like the thalamus, the hypothalamus has many nuclei that serve different purposes. Two of them, namely the lateral and ventromedial nuclei, control appetite. Specifically, the lateral nucleus serves as a hunger center, increasing appetite and food intake. To remember that, think about a yummy portion of lentil soup. The ventromedial nucleus, on the other hand, serves as a satiety center, decreasing appetite and food intake, so you can think of a voluptuous model to remember it better. The next two nuclei, called the anterior and posterior nuclei, control the temperature of the body. The anterior nucleus serves as a cooling center and uses the parasympathetic system to decrease body temperature by producing sweat and dilating blood vessels in the skin. Think about AC. The posterior nucleus, on the other hand, serves as a heating center that uses the sympathetic system to increase the temperature by constricting blood vessels in the skin, thereby decreasing sweat production and causing shivering. Think of a hot pot to remember this one. Then there is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which receives input from the retina about the presence or absence of light and uses the information to regulate many biological circadian rhythms, like the sleep-wake cycle. Therefore, you can remember the suprachiasmatic nucleus as the sun-sensing nucleus. The next two nuclei, namely the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, are in charge of hormone production. The supraoptic nucleus produces vasopressin, also known as the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. This hormone causes constriction of blood vessels, increasing peripheral vascular resistance, and it also makes the kidneys reabsorb more water from their tubules into the bloodstream. These two actions ultimately increase blood pressure. The paraventricular nucleus, on the other hand, makes oxytocin, which stimulates contractions of the uterus while in labor and later stimulates milk secretion while breastfeeding. To remember these nuclei and their hormones, you can use the SAD-POX mnemonic, where S stands for supraoptic, AD for ADH, P for paraventricular, and OX for oxytocin. Lastly, there is the preoptic nucleus, which is involved in thermoregulation and sexual behavior. It also produces gonadotropin-releasing hormone that stimulates the adenohypophysis to release the follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, or LH, which are necessary for normal gonad functioning. Okay, let's wrap up the hypothalamus by making a mid-sagittal section through the brain. Remember that the hypothalamus creates the floor and the inferior part of the lateral walls of the third ventricle. Superiorly is the thalamus, which is separated from the hypothalamus by the hypothalamic sulcus. Anteriorly, there's the optic chiasm. The hypothalamus also has a region called the preoptic area, which is located rostrally in the hypothalamus near the lamina terminalis, with the optic chiasm inferiorly and the anterior commissure superiorly. Most inferiorly, there's the tuber cinereum, which contains a small bump called the median eminence that connects with the stalk of the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Posteriorly, the hypothalamus includes the mammillary bodies and spreads to the border of the interpeduncular fossa of the midbrain, with the floor of this fossa known as the posterior perforated substance. The mammillary bodies are two rounded structures that are a part of the limbic system. They contain mammillary nuclei that receive input from the hippocampus via the fornix. The mammillary nuclei then project to the anterior nuclei of the thalamus via the mammillothalamic tracts. There is also a connection between the mammillary bodies and the midbrain tegmentum via the mammillary peduncles. On the ventral aspect of the brain, the mammillary bodies can be seen anterior to the posterior perforated substance, between the cerebral peduncles, and posterior to the tuber cinereum. Functionally, the mammillary bodies are believed to play a role in learning and memory. Let's take another short break and see if you can identify the main nuclei of the hypothalamus. Okay. Now let's take a closer look at the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis, which is actually made up of two parts, the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis. The neurohypophysis is the posterior part of the gland, which develops from the ventral side of the hypothalamus. It contains axons of the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, which carry ADH and oxytocin to the neurohypophysis to be stored. When needed, the neurohypophysis releases these hormones directly into the bloodstream via its fenestrated capillaries. The anterior part is called the adenohypophysis and develops from Rotke's pouch, which is an ectodermal diverticulum from the roof of the primitive oral cavity. Unlike the neurohypophysis, the adenohypophysis is connected to the hypothalamus through a system of blood vessels called the hypophyseal portal system. This system starts with the superior hypophyseal artery located on both sides of the gland, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery. It enters the median eminence and forms the first capillary plexus. Blood from the first plexus is gathered into hypophyseal portal veins that enter the adenohypophysis and form the second capillary plexus. Then the blood drains into the hypophyseal veins and joins the systemic circulation. The adenohypophysis makes hormones itself, but their release into the bloodstream is controlled by the hypothalamus. The neurons of the hypothalamic nuclei produce releasing hormones and release-inhibiting hormones, pack them into granules, and transport them via their axons to the median eminence, where they release them into the first capillary plexus. These hormones reach the second capillary plexus and instruct the adenohypophysis to increase or decrease hormone release. The main hormones of the adenohypophysis are growth hormone, or GH, that stimulates cell growth, thyrotropic, or thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH for short, that stimulate the thyroid gland, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, that stimulates the adrenal glands, follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH, that stimulate the gonads, and the luteotropic hormone, or LTH, also known as the prolactin, that stimulates milk production and secretion. On a mid-sagittal section of the brain, the pituitary gland sits in the middle of the sphenoid bone in a depression called the sella turcica. Superiorly, there's the median eminence of the hypothalamus. Now, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland has a stalk called the infundibulum that connects to the median eminence. These three structures form the neurohypophysis. Anterior to the pituitary gland, there's the optic chiasm, while posterior to it, there are the mammillary bodies. The pituitary gland is closely related to the cavernous sinuses, which almost enclose the pituitary gland on each side. Since this is the only visible part of the diencephalon, if we switch to the ventral side of the brain, we can see the infundibulum sitting between the optic chiasm anteriorly and the mammillary bodies posteriorly. Lastly, let's cover the second endocrine gland of the diencephalon, which is the pineal gland, named so because of its pinecone shape. The main function of the pineal gland is regulation of the sleep-wake cycle by production of melatonin, a hormone that helps us fall asleep. It receives information from the retina about the presence or absence of light, which allows it to know if it is day or night. Once it gets darker, the pineal gland starts releasing melatonin into the bloodstream and the CSF of the third ventricle, which prepares us for sleep. It is also believed that the pineal gland can influence the hormone secretion of other endocrine glands, like the pituitary, parathyroid, endocrine pancreas, adrenal glands, and gonads. On a mid-sagittal section through the brain, the pineal gland has a central, midline position. It sits just caudal to the thalamus and is attached to it by a hollow stalk filled with CSF from the third ventricle. The pineal gland protrudes posteriorly, lying superior to the superior colliculi. It is also a part of the central nervous system that doesn't have the blood-brain barrier. Alright, as a quick recap, the diencephalon is a part of the forebrain that sits between the cerebral hemispheres, connecting the cerebrum with the midbrain. It contains the thalamus, dorsally, and the hypothalamus ventrally. These form the lateral walls and floor of the third ventricle. The thalamus serves as a relay station for almost all sensory pathways and afferent signals that are targeting the cerebral cortex. Major nuclei of the thalamus are ventral posterolateral, or VPL, which relays information from the spinothalamic tract and medial lemniscus, ventral posteromedial, or VPM, which relays information from trigeminal and gustatory pathways, lateral geniculate body, which relays visual system information, medial geniculate body, which relays auditory information, and the ventral lateral nucleus, which relays information from motor systems. The hypothalamus regulates homeostasis and controls hormone production of the pituitary gland. It has several nuclei: lateral and ventromedial nuclei that regulate appetite, anterior and posterior nuclei that regulate body temperature, suprachiasmatic nucleus that regulates circadian rhythms, supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei that produce ADH and oxytocin, and the preoptic nucleus that is related to thermoregulation and sexual behavior. The pituitary gland contains the neurohypophysis, which is a part of the diencephalon and secretes ADH and oxytocin, and the adenohypophysis that develops from Rotke's pouch. It secretes hormones that influence other endocrine glands in the body. The pineal gland secretes melatonin and regulates the sleep-wake cycle.
The cervical viscera are composed of 3 layers named after their primary function. The most superficial layer is the endocrine layer, which contains the thyroid and parathyroid glands. Then there's the respiratory layer, which contains the larynx and trachea, and finally, the deepest layer is the alimentary layer, which contains the pharynx and esophagus. Let's focus on the endocrine layer. The thyroid gland is the largest endocrine gland in the body, and it produces 2 hormones: thyroid hormone and calcitonin. It's located anteriorly in the neck at the level of the C5 to T1 vertebrae and deep to the sternothyroid and sternohyoid muscles. It consists of a right and left lobe, located anterolateral to the larynx and trachea. These lobes are united over the trachea by a thin isthmus, usually anterior to the second and third tracheal rings, giving it an H-shaped appearance. In some people, there is a third lobe, called the pyramidal lobe, which usually arises from the isthmus and extends up to the hyoid bone. Now, the thyroid gland is surrounded by a thin fibrous capsule which sends septa deep into the gland, and this capsule is attached to the cricoid cartilage and the superior tracheal rings by dense connective tissue. External to the capsule, the visceral portion of the pretracheal layer of deep cervical fascia forms a loose sheath, and between this loose sheath and the fibrous capsule, there's the superior and inferior thyroid arteries which supply the gland. The superior thyroid arteries are usually the first branches of the external carotid arteries, and they descend to the superior poles of the gland. Then, pierce the pretracheal layer of deep cervical fascia, and finally, divide into anterior and posterior branches which supply mainly the anterosuperior aspect of the gland. The inferior thyroid arteries are the largest branches of the thyrocervical trunks, and they run supromedially posterior to the carotid sheaths to reach the posterior aspect of the gland, where they divide into several branches that pierce the pretracheal layer of deep cervical fascia and supply the postero-inferior aspect of the gland, including the inferior poles of the gland. In approximately 10% of people, there's an additional small artery called the thyroidema artery, which can arise from different locations such as the brachiocephalic trunk, the arch of the aorta, the right common carotid artery, subclavian artery, and internal thoracic artery. When it's present, this artery ascends on the anterior surface of the trachea, to which it supplies small branches, and then continues to supply the isthmus of the gland. The venous drainage of the thyroid gland is through 3 pairs of thyroid veins: superior thyroid veins, which accompany the superior thyroid arteries and drain the superior poles of the gland, middle thyroid veins, which run parallel with the inferior thyroid arteries and drain the middle of the lobes, and the inferior thyroid veins, which drain the inferior poles of the gland. And so that should be pretty easy to remember, right? So these three pairs of thyroid veins usually form a thyroid plexus of veins on the anterior surface of the gland anterior to the trachea. The superior and middle thyroid veins drain into the internal jugular vein, and the inferior thyroid veins drain into the brachiocephalic veins. The innervation of the thyroid gland is primarily provided by sympathetic nerves derived from the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia that reach the gland through the cardiac plexus, the superior and inferior thyroid periarterial plexuses that accompany the thyroid arteries. These fibers are vasomotor, causing constriction of the blood vessels. Now, the parathyroid glands are small, flattened, oval endocrine glands which secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone, or PTH. These glands are usually located on the medial half of the posterior surface of each lobe of the thyroid gland inside its fibrous sheath. There are typically 4 glands, but this can vary. The superior parathyroid glands are located at the level of the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage, and the inferior parathyroid glands are located near the inferior poles of the thyroid gland. But again, this may vary. The parathyroid glands are supplied by branches of the inferior thyroid artery, since this artery is the main blood supplier of the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. However, they may also be supplied by branches from superior thyroid arteries, the thyroid ema artery, or laryngeal, tracheal, and esophageal arteries. The venous drainage is provided by the parathyroid veins, which drain into the superior, middle, and inferior thyroid veins. The parathyroid glands are innervated by the thyroid branches of the cervical sympathetic ganglia. Again, these nerves are vasomotor, causing vasoconstriction, and are not involved in the secretion of hormones. Alright, as a quick recap, the cervical viscera are arranged in 3 layers: endocrine layer, respiratory layer, and alimentary layer. The endocrine layer contains the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. The thyroid gland consists of 2 lobes, right lobe and left lobe, which are located anterolateral to the larynx and trachea, and they are united over the trachea by a thin isthmus, which gives it an H-shaped appearance. In some people, there is a third lobe called the pyramidal lobe, which usually arises from the isthmus and extends up to the hyoid bone. On the posterior aspect of the thyroid, there are 4 small endocrine glands called the parathyroid glands.